Today I want to talk about scraping a painting to focus more on the brushwork or paint quality of the painting. I did a video sometime back, not too long ago, where I talked about scraping a wet painting after you get a block in finished so that you can go back and focus on the brushwork of the painting. Because when you scrape a wet painting, all the drawing is still there, the colors and values are still there, but there's just a bit more texture from the canvas or the board left, so you can go back and repaint and focus more on the brushwork. So that's what I want to do today. I will explain it a little bit better and show what I'm talking about. Now today I want to talk about scraping a painting while it's wet, or you can even do it when it's dry, just scrape off excess paint, to be able to get down to a little bit more surface that you can paint into. I did a video where I talked about scraping a wet painting and then painting back into it, even when it dries, to get a little bit better brushstroke quality or paint quality than what you have when everything's wet and wet. Because when we block in a painting, fill in all the big areas with wet paint, we get to a point where the surface is just kind of saturated and it's hard to add any more color on there. So scraping it is a good idea. A lot of times I will scrape at this stage, let it dry, and then paint back over it. And when I do that, I can focus more on the brushwork and less on composition, value, and mixing color, because everything will still be there. It'll just be really thin paint. I'll have more texture of the board or canvas to grab hold of the paint. I have a painting here I did. This is in the studio. I took the photograph in southern Colorado. And I did a block in. It's a 9x12. And I tend to block in color-wise with thicker paint because the color has more impact when it's thicker. Now, not always. A lot of times I will block in the darks first, real thin, and then start blocking in lights and halftones using some thicker and some thin paint. But if I'm in a hurry, especially if I'm outside, I just use thick paint to block it in and then scrape it and then repaint it. So I thought I would scrape this. I just blocked it in yesterday, and I'm just gonna scrape it. Now this is a canvas board. If I scrape a canvas surface, it's a little better. The drawing doesn't smear quite as much. And I kind of scrape a section at a time so I'm not blending in too many colors together. But you can see as I'm scraping, I'm getting rid of a lot of paint. But I still have the drawing, the composition, the values are still there, the big shapes. And it just becomes easy. You can tell when I scrape down, I just lose some of the drawing there. So I'm going to scrape horizontally on this one. But as I get rid of the excess paint, the drawing is still there. The value is still there. Everything is still there except the thick paint. And I can repaint this and focus a bit more on the brushwork, edges and thick and thin paint and interlocking brush strokes, things like that. Whereas before, you have a harder time doing that because you're trying to focus on getting the right color, mixing the right color, get the right color and value relationships, and sometimes the brushwork can kind of suffer. And that may be just my own inability to do all that at the same time, but it's a good idea to be able to come back and scrape that. A lot of times I would let this dry and then paint back over it, and I can let a lot of this color come through. So I could repaint the painting twice as fast because I have, again, all the drawing, all the colors are there, and it's just a matter of remixing and then applying the paint how I want. Now I do have on the palette some of the areas. I'm just going to touch up a couple of areas here. I'm not going to do the whole thing, but just to show you what I'm talking about. I've mixed up, I'm going to do the trees here, at least right here, and a little bit of the foreground grass. I have the 3 values mixed up, the dark, the light, the shadow, dark, halftone, and light. Same thing with some of the grass, a little bit on the mountains too, the cliffs back there. But now I can focus on, again, I've got the 3 values that I've decided I want to do, and I can, again, I don't have to worry about the drawing because it's already there. And I can lay the values in here as I want them. The tree here is gradually getting a little bit darker, moving from light to kind of halftone as it goes down there, down close to the shadow. Something over here, I can vary the color a little bit more. I'll just change the color, but same value. And there's a lot of textured surface there that the paint picks up, and it just grabs the brush stroke or the paint a lot better. I think it gives me a little bit better brush quality or paint quality or whatever you want to call it. And now jump to the shadows. And I can modify the color a bit more than what I had before if I want to spend time doing that. I'm using a flat brush. It's a bright. It's kind of straight across and a little wider than a filbert or a flat, and has a real sharp edge to it. So I got a kind of a sharp edge to the shapes there, which I like with trees and mountains. And I can always turn it on the edge and lose that straight, flat brushstroke look if I wanted to. But letting some of the paint underneath show through. And I can even leave the tree trunk there that I had. Because the scraped paint underneath is real similar in value and color, I can let some of that show through. And I can still paint back into wet. It's not like I'm not trying to paint wet into wet at all, but just getting rid of the excess paint. I can still go back in and get a little value change in the shadows to show some form inside the shadow. Not much form. You don't want to get a lot of shape and form inside of a shadow. The shadow's darker. You don't see as much in it. Now I'm going to drop down to the value of the grass down here, and I have it mixed up, 2 or 3 values, some different colors. I want to follow the shape of the kind of slightly rounded ground there to show the form. It's not a flat ground, it's slanted. So I want the brush strokes to kind of follow it. Again, letting some of that color underneath show through. Now I want to do a little bit on the cliffs back in here, just to show some of that and get some of this excess paint scraped down a little bit more. Now if I'm painting on dry paint scraped, Let's scrape it, let it dry. Then I can use a little bit more dry brush to let things skip along and show a little bit more texture on the canvas. But again, the drawings here, I can be more careful, more deliberate on my shapes. And just set up the shadow pattern. Again, the drawing's all there. Makes it easier now to focus on what I want to do as far as the brush strokes go. And you know, brush strokes, or how you apply the paint technique-wise, is really not the most important thing. You know, what's more important is how I arrange or compose the shapes, the values of those shapes and how they relate together, and then color harmony. How I apply it's probably the least important, but if I want to pay attention to that, I find it easier to kind of scrape down again once I've established the drawing and the main values. Now the lights here I want to build up. I kept the darks thinner. And I can get some sharp edges. These cliffs are very sharp edged. And even here I can scrape down if I get a stroke I don't like, or value or color I don't like. And let some of what's underneath show through. Scrape down, it's a bit of a half tone in the lights. Then there's kind of a foothill here to that cliff. It's a little darker, a little more muted. Because it's a different plane. These are more vertical, this is more slanted. So they're going to be different, at least value-wise, but they're also more muted. This kind of slide off from the cliff. And there's a lot going on in there in the reference. A lot of different values and colors. I don't need to show all of it. I'm going to pick what I think is most important or kind of helps the painting, but keep it simplified. It's going to just read better if it's not overly detailed, but trying to put everything I see in there. So a little bit of shadow blended in, real soft edges here on this slanted hillside. I can get more subtle now because I've got less paint and I'm putting the thicker paint where I want and letting some of the scraped paint show through underneath. This is a kind of an extra long filbert. This one's from Rosemary. I also get them from Utrecht. Their bristle brushes have an extra long filbert or an eggbert. I don't know if they still call them that anymore. But this doesn't disturb the paint much, but I can push and pull some edges. Don't care for that. Just to soften some of the edges. It kind of helps with the shape, making some things recede or come forward or kind of turn around with a softer edge. Softer edge creates a bit of a halftone because you're blending a little bit. But I have less paint there to go back into. And I don't do this all the time or even a lot, but if I'm getting a lot of paint on the canvas in the block-in stage, in other words, get the canvas toned and drawn on there, usually with a turpentine wash, simple value drawing with turpentine and burnt sienna or raw umber. Then laying in big areas of color, starting with the darks. And I can have a tendency to get my darks too thick. And then you get thick paint in the lights as well, and pretty soon all the surface is kind of covered up, and there's no room left on the surface to add any more paint, add some color variation or broken color, little value changes if I need some. It also helps in the sense that I don't have to worry about being real exact with the thickness or thinness of the paint. I can just scrape it when it's... So I know I can scrape it when I'm done blocking it in and then go back and repaint. And again, focus more on the brushwork than about mixing colors or the values, because they'll be already set up and thinned down by scraping it.